Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the QUT Faculty of Law for today's conference on intellectual property and education in the age of COVID. As is always the case, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, and in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where QUT now stands and recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning, and we wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. And in the context of debates around intellectual property and education, there has been very significant discussion about the importance of Indigenous intellectual property. Today's event is going to look at some of the relationships and connections and intersections between intellectual property and education. It will cover many different species of intellectual property, spanning copyright law, trademark law, patent law, trade secrets, and questions of licensing. In many ways, the conference today is also going to span an array of different disciplines within education, everything from the creative industries to medicine and biotechnology and even clean technology. In addition, this event is also going to focus upon open licensing within the educational institutions. So the use of open licensing to promote open access, open innovation and open data is also a very kind of important dimension in terms of the debate and discussion over intellectual property and education. This event is also going to focus upon the role of universities and educational institutions and research organisations in responding to the coronavirus COVID-19 public health crisis. So universities and research institutions have a very particular special role to play as keystones in the knowledge infrastructure. They are generating a whole wide range of technologies that could be of use in tackling the coronavirus crisis, including vaccines, treatments and diagnostics, as well as a range of other public policy solutions. So this event, amongst other things, is going to think about ways and means in which we can encourage public transfer of some of those research and public policy solutions. Finally, this event is also going to be an Australian launch for this research handbook on intellectual property and technology transfer, edited by Professor Jacob Rooksbury from Gonzaga Law School. This collection provides a comparative analysis of how an array of different countries manage intellectual property and technology transfer from educational institutions, and also kind of includes a contribution by myself looking at intellectual property and higher education and 3D printing. So welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy today's range of presentations looking at different aspects of intellectual property and education. Thank you. Our next session is going to focus on patent law and education, and we're very blessed at QUT to have the Centre for Behavioural Economics, Society and Technology, better known as BEST, who do a lot of work in terms of empirical research in respect of patents and higher education. So one of the many researchers working in that group is Annita Nugent, who is a PhD candidate. She has a great deal of experience in dealing with university management of intellectual property in a range of different contexts. Today she'll be talking about university industry collaboration and the effect of government funding.
So thank you, Matthew. As Matthew said, today I'm talking about university-industry collaboration and the effect of government funding. And it's really only been in about probably the last 40 years that there's been a really big push and an emphasis to increase university-industry collaboration with governments wanting universities to play a bigger role in the innovation ecosystem. So arguably, probably one of the big drivers that changed the mission of universities and introduced innovation as its third mission came about with the Bayh-Dole Act in the 1980s. And that was quite significant in the US because it meant that for the first time, universities were able to manage and take responsibility of the IP that they created that was federally funded. So before that, the funding bodies used to take control of the IP and manage the intellectual property, which basically meant that nothing happened with it. And similarly, around the world, there were lots of various legislation came into play to drive universities, encouraging them to be more innovative, to be engage more with industry partners. And in Australia, the Dawkins reform is one of the pieces of reform that came into play about 1987, and that introduced the CRCs as well, which was one of our big university industry collaborations. And as you can see, around the time of those introduction of those new policies came an increase in patent activity, both in the States and in Australia. And that increase was above the usual increase in patent activity overall. So the universities were actually, the rate of increase of the patent activity was far greater than it was for other organisations at that time. So it really was an indication that these changes in policy and legislation were driving that university patent activity. So why is it that universities, well, why is it that governments encourage university industry collaboration? And there's a whole heap of reasons: increasing innovation, hastening the technology transfer. One of the things that's quite resonates in Australia is that they're trying to, governments are encouraging alternate funding sources for universities. They're looking for other mechanisms that we can fund universities with, and hoping that industry is going to pick up some of that slack. And despite lots and lots of different mechanisms that we have in Australia to encourage university industry collaboration, and the investment that the government makes through CRC, through the ARC program in HMRC, we still perform fairly poorly in Australia compared to other countries when it comes to university industry collaboration. And that's despite the fact that we have a very good research reputation, and so traditional measures of publications and citations, we perform like in the top 10%, whereas when you look down at university industry collaboration, we're right at the bottom. And that's something that hasn't gone unnoticed by our government and our leaders. And so back when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, which probably lets you know how long ago it was that I started on this study. So he was very passionate about the idea that universities needed to start to engage more with industry, and he came up with the mantra, collaborate or crumble. And he was also, or his government was also responsible for the introduction of the National Innovation and Science Agenda. And one of the 4 pillars of that was collaboration. And the interesting thing that I like about this is it's suggesting that we're going to increase collaboration between universities and industry by changing the funding. And that always begs the question, well, how are they going to change the funding? What's happening with the funding now? How's it working? And therefore, how do we know what we want to change the funding to? And for some people, we may remember quite a few years ago, there was rumours aplenty that the CRC program, which is one of our major funding mechanisms for university industry collaboration, was about to be disbanded. And that came about as a recommendation out of a National Commission audit, where the question was asked, why do we have so many different funding mechanisms? And can we be more efficient by consolidating all the different funding mechanisms? Fortunately, I think that hasn't happened, but it does beg the question, why do we have different funding mechanisms? And given that they're all purposed with trying to achieve the same outcome of encouraging innovation from universities, increasing university and government, university and industry collaboration, why do we have different mechanisms, and which ones are more effective? So there's been quite a few studies done looking at various funding mechanisms that are actually targeting university industry collaboration. They tend to look at the the impact that has on the industry partner and on the industry innovation. But what I'm particularly interested in is what do these targeted funding schemes, what's their impact actually on university innovation? And so my research question is, does the award of targeted grants coincide with increased patent activity compared to the award of non-targeted grants? And for this, I'm taking advantage of the Australian Research Council funding schemes. So they run two schemes that are very similar, the linkage scheme and the discovery scheme. The main difference being that the linkage requires an industry partner and industry commitment, whereas the discovery program doesn't. So taking advantage of that, I'm wanting to see how that affects the innovation output from the universities and from the inventors. So with my study, I take the university inventors, so the complete population of university inventors in Australia, which I'm collecting from the IP Australia database and various details of those, and matching that up with the ARC database, looking to see which of those inventors are getting discovery grants, linkage grants, and looking to see whether it's the inventors who get the linkages are more likely to file patents. And for that study, I'm just starting at 2001 to 2012 using panel data. So the 2001 is because that's when the ARC scheme came into place, and finishing at 2012 because I want to get an idea or make sure that the patents that I'm looking at have been finally dealt with. So in my sample, there's no patent applications at all. They've either been granted or lapsed or ceased. And then just to get a bit more information about my inventors and also the universities, I look at some of their university affiliations, how old they are, their age, which is I used as a year since they were first published, information about their the university environment, so the publications, the research funding that comes into the university, the commercialisation support that it's getting. And I also break down the study looking at the various types of university affiliations, so whether the inventor belongs to a GO8 university or some of the other main university affiliations that we have. And so this is a snapshot of my university inventors. So there's just under 2,500 university inventors. On average, they're named in that period, 2001 to 2012, they're named 1.6 times, or they have 1.6 patent applications. They have 0.85 or just under one granted patent on average, and just over 0.6 linkage grants and 0.7 DPs on average for the inventors. And then for the universities, again, I look at a university level, the 36 universities that make up the Australian universities that report regularly to the HERDEC reports. And this is a bit small to see, but the actual snapshot, you can see we have some really overachieving inventors. So all of our inventors have got at least one patent application. The maximum is a inventor with 16 patent applications. For the, similarly with the grants, ARC funding, there's again some overachievers with up to 20 linkage grants. And then looking at the universities, so when I look at the universities, I see some of the universities don't actually have any patent applications or any discoveries. So that would be universities like, for example, Charles Darwin University, Federation University, some of those universities that we don't really associate with research excellence, I guess. So just to start with, what I did was I took the cohort of the inventors that actually had grants. So this is a cohort of about 900 researchers that we're looking at here, and I was looking to isolate the effect of the years that they got ARC funding. So the years that they got ARC funding, if it was a targeted grant, a linkage grant, they were more likely to file patent applications and have patents granted in that same year or the following year, compared to the years where they didn't get any grants. So there's a strong suggestion that the linkage, people with the linkage grants and the targeted grants were more likely to be active around the time that they got around the time they got those grants, compared to researchers being awarded discovery grants. So that suggests that perhaps they are doing something slightly different, the two grant schemes. So I've taken an econometric approach. So I developed a model based on thinking that patent activity is a function of the number of targeted grants that researchers are getting, non-targeted, also the research environment that they are working in, the inventor attributes, and also just the control. And when I look at that, the data from that, using negative binomial regression, so what we see is that indeed there's a strong correlation, significant correlation between researchers who are getting patent application, who are receiving funding, and the patent applications and granted patents, which is what we'd expect. Again, that correlation is stronger for targeted ARC funding compared to non-targeted funding. So again, that's what I was sort of looking to see. Is there a difference between whether a researcher gets targeted funding and non-targeted funding and their patent activity? Then I was wanting to, in this next part, I used GMM to look at what the lag time was. So in the previous first table, we were looking to see what the correlation was. In this one, we were trying to see, can we show that there's actually a lead-in, that there's a causality, if you like, between people receiving ARC funding and then filing patents or patent activity. And so the first two columns are looking at that. They're looking to see whether there's any correlation between being awarded funding in the previous year and patent activity in future years. And we didn't actually see any significant results between this, targeted grants and patent activity. But when it came to the non-targeted discovery grants, there was actually a slightly significant results, which was a bit interesting. Then we looked at the reverse effect. So in some of the literature, there's been a suggestion of what comes first. Is it the collaboration and the patent activity, or is it the funding that comes first? And so to do that, we allowed for the targeted grant or the targeted and non-targeted grants to be the outcome variable, and we regressed that against the number of patents. And with that, we didn't see anything to suggest that there was a reverse causality, to suggest that there was a patent activity itself that was leading to the success of the grants. And then we did a similar take looking at a university level. And again, our results were the same as for the individual level. So at the university level, we're getting increased patent activity with the number of targeted and non-targeted ARC funding, but the targeted funding has a stronger correlation and a stronger effect than the non-targeted. And then in our final part, what we're looking to see in this is we're looking to see if there was an interplay between, if you like, the targeted and non-targeted grants. So if we just keep on increasing targeted grants without non-targeted grants, what happens then versus if we just have increased targeted, non-targeted grants? And what we see with this, if you're looking at the second column, and when we have the R squared, the ratio squared, what we see is that there's an inverse relationship, which suggests that there's a space somewhere between having all one sort of grant and all the other sort of grant. So we need the two to get the optimal innovation, if you like, or the optimum patent activity. So that's where my study is up to at the moment. So I guess overall what we're seeing is that there is a positive correlation between ARC grants and patent activity, which is what we were expecting and hoping. The other thing that we were hoping to see was that there is actually greater activity with targeted versus non-targeted. There wasn't really much of a suggestion of a causal relationship though, so to be able to say wholeheartedly which one comes first. And from a policy perspective, that's fairly important because obviously government wants to think that it's the one causing the collaborations to happen. And we did see like the weak interaction between the two types of grants. And for me, my next steps when I'm thinking where to go to with this is looking to see what happens when the targeted funding is industry-led as opposed to university-led. So at the moment, the ARC funding, I think of as university-led, so that's the universities that have applied for the funding. Running in parallel with that, in the last few years, the government's released a new funding scheme, the CRC project scheme, which is quite similar in a lot of respects to the ARC linkage scheme, except with the difference that the CRC scheme is driven by the industry partner, and it's the industry partners that's the applicant. So I'm interested to see with that which one of those two has the biggest impact on innovation, and is there to help with the government to think, well, how do they proportion the money between, like a limited pot of funding between those two schemes? Thanks.